In the quiet years before the storm, Britain did not yet realize it was preparing to gamble its survival on an aircraft that barely existed outside a drawing office and a handful of test flights. Europe was uneasy, rearming in fragments and rumors, but no one could yet imagine the scale of violence about to descend. And somewhere, in a Supermarine design room, an aeroplane was taking shape that would soon be asked to do the impossible fight. Not just an enemy, but time itself. No one watching the early prototype skim over the grass at Eastleigh could have guessed how brutally it would be tested only months later, when everything Britain thought it knew about air warfare would be torn apart. The man behind the aircraft was Reginald Joseph Mitchell, already famous for designing racing seaplanes that shattered speed records. Mitchell did not design fighters the way generals imagined them. He designed them the way engineers chase speed. Every curve of the Spitfire was shaped by airflow, not doctrine. The elliptical wing-thin, elegant, and aerodynamically efficient is not meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be fast. But beauty came at a cost. That wing took nearly 3 times the labor hours to build compared to its German rival, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. This was not a design optimized for mass war. It was a design optimized for performance, and war was about to punish that decision mercilessly. When the Spitfire Mark I entered RAF service in 1938 and early 1939, it was far from perfect, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Producing just over 1,000 horsepower, it was lightly armed with 8.303 machine guns spread thinly across the wings. These guns were prone to jamming, especially during violent high-G maneuvers. Its control surfaces was still fabric-covered, a holdover from earlier aircraft generations. Even its paint scheme was confused, one wing painted black, the other white, an improvised solution to prevent friendly fire that only highlighted how unprepared Britain truly was. And yet, beneath these flaws, there was something else, something dangerous to Britain's enemies. Speed. When war finally came in September 1939, it arrived faster than Britain's factories could fully adjust. The RAF entered combat with 2 main fighters: the Hurricane, sturdy and forgiving, and the Spitfire, fast and unforgiving. The Hurricane would shoulder much of the bombing defense, but the Spitfire would be thrown into the most critical role of all, fighting the Luftwaffe's fighters head-on. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. The Battle of Britain was not a single clash, but a relentless grinding campaign. Every day, German bombers crossed the Channel escorted by Messerschmitt 109s, aiming to break Britain's air defenses and force surrender. The Spitfire did not dominate the skies, but it did something just as vital. It forced German fighters into combat, dragging them away from bombers and buying precious minutes. Minutes that meant factories survived. Minutes that meant radar stations stayed operational. Minutes that meant Britain stayed in the war. This is where the Spitfire's legend was born, but also where its weaknesses were exposed in blood and smoke. Pilots loved the aircraft's responsiveness. They hated its fragility. Early Spitfires were fast but delicate, demanding constant maintenance. Losses were heavy, and replacements were never enough. The aircraft was already being modified mid-battle, guns repositioned, armor added. Production methods refined because standing still meant death. And as Britain fought for survival, the man who created its most famous defender was already gone. Reginald Mitchell died in 1937, at just 42 years old, weakened by cancer. He lived long enough to see the prototype fly once, but not long enough to see the aircraft tested by war. The responsibility for the Spitfire's future passed quietly to Joseph Smith, a methodical engineer with none of Mitchell's flair, but all of his discipline. Smith would soon discover that he was not inheriting a finished aircraft, but a living problem that demanded constant change. As German tactics evolved, as aircraft grew faster and deadlier, the Spitfire could not remain what it was. The war did not reward perfection. It rewarded adaptation. Every weakness exposed in combat had to be corrected, often within weeks, sometimes within days. This is why, even in its moment of greatest fame during 1940, the Spitfire was already becoming obsolete. The aircraft that symbolized Britain's defiance was, paradoxically, already being overtaken by the very war it was helping to fight. And if this early version struggled to survive against Germany's first generation of fighters, what would happen when the enemy inevitably came back with something better? Before we go further, If you're enjoying this deep dive into how war reshapes technology, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people discover stories like this and allows us to keep bringing history to life in this level of detail. Because the real story of the Spitfire is not how it saved Britain once, but how it was forced to change again and again just to stay alive. And Germany was already preparing its next move. The victory of 1940 settled nothing. It merely paused the clock. Across the Channel, German engineers studied combat reports with ruthless clarity. They had not been defeated by British courage alone. They had been delayed by a system that combined radar, ground control, and fighters at just the right moment. And now, with Britain bloodied but unbroken, Germany set out to correct its mistakes, not with speeches, but with metal. What emerged in 1941 was a shock that rippled through RAF squadrons almost overnight. The aircraft was called the Focke-Wulf 190. From the moment it appeared over northern France, pilots knew something had changed. The FW-190 was heavier than the Spitfire Mark V, armed with devastating cannon, and powered by a robust radial engine that could absorb punishment the Merlin-powered Spitfire could not. It rolled faster, it dove faster, it accelerated harder. In many situations, it could choose when to fight and when to leave. Suddenly, the aircraft that had symbolized British survival was being hunted. RAF pilots returning from sweeps over occupied Europe brought back the same reports again and again. The enemy could outclimb them at low altitude. The enemy could disengage at will. Dogfights ended not with victory, but with frustration and fuel starvation. In some encounters, the Spitfire was not outflown, it was outclassed. And worse still, there was no brand new replacement waiting in the wings. Britain did not respond by unveiling a revolutionary new fighter. There was no clean sheet design ready to save the day. Instead, the response followed a pattern that would define the Spitfire's entire wartime existence. Modify, adapt, improvise now. The result was the Spitfire Mark V. Then came the most controversial change of all. The elliptical wing, the very symbol of the Spitfire's grace, was altered. Wingtips were clipped, reducing the aircraft's turning radius, but dramatically increasing its roll rate. The Spitfire was sacrificing elegance for survival. In a war where milliseconds mattered, the ability to roll out of danger could mean the difference between landing safely and burning into the sea. The beauty that once defined the aircraft was now negotiable. This was not innovation driven by vision. It was innovation driven by fear, loss, and urgency. The Mark V helped, but it did not solve the problem. Against the Messerschmitt 109, the Spitfire could still hold its own. Against the Focke-Wulf 190, it remained at a disadvantage. German pilots knew it. British pilots felt it. The air war over Europe had become a dangerous balancing act, where victory depended less on aircraft superiority and more on surprise, numbers, and positioning. Every mission became a gamble. British engineers were painfully aware that they were approaching the limits of what the Merlin engine could deliver in its current form. They were extracting power that Mitchell's original design had never imagined. Cooling systems were stretched. Airframes were stressed. Margins were thinning. The Spitfire was no longer evolving by design, it was evolving by pressure. Inside Supermarine, Joseph Smith faced a brutal reality. Each improvement solved one problem and created another. More power demanded more cooling. More armor demanded stronger wings. Stronger wings added weight. Weight robbed speed. Every solution came with consequences that rippled through the aircraft like stress fractures. And all the while, the enemy kept moving forward. By late 1941 and into 1942, RAF pilots knew they were flying an aircraft that was just barely keeping pace with the war. The Spitfire was no longer the hunter, it was often the aircraft trying to survive long enough to complete the mission. Morale suffered quietly, not because pilots lacked courage, but because they understood the stakes. Air combat was not romantic, it was statistical. It favored the side that learned faster. And Germany, at that moment, appeared to be learning faster. There was talk uncomfortable, dangerous talk about whether the Spitfire had reached the end of its usefulness. Some questioned whether Britain should finally abandon it and focus entirely on new designs. Others argued that the aircraft's core was still sound, that it simply needed one more breakthrough. That breakthrough did not come from Supermarine alone. It came from Rolls-Royce. Behind closed doors, engineers were working on a transformation that would redefine what the Merlin engine could do. It was not a new engine in name, but it was something fundamentally different in capability. A solution that addressed the very weakness the Focke-Wulf had exposed, but it was not ready. And until it was, pilots would continue to fight at the edge of what their machines could endure. The Spitfire Mark V would serve in huge numbers across multiple theaters, and it would score victories, but it carried an unspoken truth in its rivets and stressed panels. It was a holding action in aluminum and steel. The war was accelerating. Aircraft were becoming faster, heavier, and deadlier with each passing month. And for the first time since 1938, Britain faced the possibility that its most iconic fighter might be left behind, not because it failed, but because the enemy refused to stand still. The Spitfire had survived its baptism of fire. It had endured emergency modification. It had been bent, reinforced, and pushed beyond its original limits. But now, the question was no longer whether it could adapt again. The question was whether adaptation would come in time, because somewhere inside a factory and a test bench, a new version of the Merlin was being prepared, one that would decide whether the Spitfire remained relevant or became a relic of an earlier phase of the war. By 1943, the air war over Europe had become a contest of margins so thin that survival often depended on seconds, meters, and fleeting glimpses through a gun sight. The skies were no longer dominated by daring improvisation or lucky encounters. They were ruled by systems engine performance curves, climb rates, at altitude, and who could see first, react first, and strike without warning. For the Spitfire, this year would decide whether it remained a frontline weapon or quietly faded into obsolescence. What arrived on operational airfields in early 1943 did not look revolutionary at first glance. Pilots saw the familiar wings, the familiar canopy, the familiar shape that had become synonymous with British resistance. But as soon as they opened the throttle, they knew something fundamental had changed. The answer was hidden inside the engine cowling. Rolls-Royce had solved the problem that haunted Britain since the appearance of the Focke-Wulf 190. The new two-stage, two-speed, intercooled supercharged Merlin transformed the Spitfire's performance envelope. Installed in what became known as the Spitfire Mark IX, it delivered between 1,650 and 1,700 horsepower, restoring altitude performance that had been slipping away for years. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the Spitfire could climb with confidence again. High-altitude interceptions no longer felt like desperate uphill struggles. German fighters that once dictated the terms of engagement now found themselves beaten by a machine they thought they had already surpassed. For pilots who had endured the limitations of the Mark V, the Mark IX felt like redemption. Yet, this restoration of balance did not come without cost. The aircraft's nose grew longer to accommodate the larger supercharger. A four-bladed propeller replaced earlier designs. Twin radiators appeared beneath the wings. The Spitfire was still elegant, but its elegance now bore the marks of war functional, purposeful, and unmistakably lethal. This was no longer Mitchell's racer adapted for combat. This was a weapon forged by experience. Combat in 1943 was unforgiving. Dogfights rarely resembled the turning duels of early war mythology. Pilots climbed, stalked, and struck from advantage whenever possible. A single misjudgment, one missed contact report, one glance in the wrong direction could be fatal. In this environment, the Mark IX thrived. It could fight the Focke-Wulf 190 on nearly equal terms. It could regain altitude quickly after an attack. It could pursue or disengage with confidence. For the first time in years, British pilots felt they were no longer reacting to German innovation, they were contesting it. One of those pilots was Air Vice Marshal James "Johnny" Johnson, the highest-scoring British fighter ace. To survive the war, Johnson flew the Mark IX extensively, and his combat record spoke not only to his skill, but to the aircraft's maturity. This was a Spitfire that rewarded discipline, awareness, and aggression in equal measure. And yet, even at this peak, the Spitfire was not invincible. Victory in 1943 increasingly depended on who saw whom first. Radar guided fighters into the right airspace, but the final moments of combat were still decided by human perception. A fraction of a second determined whether a pilot became the hunter or tempted. The Mark IX restored balance, but it did not restore certainty. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce understood this reality with cold clarity. They had bought time, but time was never free in wartime. Every improvement pushed the Merlin closer to its absolute limits. Cooling systems ran hotter, airframes carried more stress. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly to keep aircraft operational under conditions they were never designed to endure. The Spitfire was now fighting the enemy on its own engineering ceiling. Still, this version of the aircraft represented something remarkable. It proved that continuous development could overcome sudden enemy advantage. It validated the philosophy that had kept the Spitfire alive since 1938. Never stopped changing, but the war itself was changing again. By late 1943, the character of aerial combat began to shift. The Allies prepared for large-scale offensives. Missions grew longer, heavier, and more complex. Fighters were asked not only to intercept, but to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, to conduct reconnaissance, and to dominate airspace for hours at a time. The Spitfire, originally designed as a point-defense interceptor, was being pushed into roles it had never been meant to fill. And somewhere on the horizon loomed a more uncomfortable truth. Even as the Mark IX proved itself, engineers knew the Merlin engine was approaching the end of its development potential. There were gains still to be made, but they were shrinking, incremental, and increasingly costly. Physics was tightening its grip. The Spitfire had adapted once again. It had survived a second crisis. It had reclaimed relevance in a war that showed no mercy to stagnation. But adaptation alone would not be enough forever, because the next phase of the war would demand more speed, more power, and more versatility than any previous generation of piston-engine fighters had ever delivered. The skies were becoming crowded with heavier aircraft, faster tactics, and missions that pushed endurance to its limits. And even as the Mark IX soared at the height of its success, a larger, more powerful engine was waiting in the wings, one that would change the Spitfire's character forever. Before we continue, if this story of relentless wartime evolution is holding your attention, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps this channel reach more people who appreciate deep, immersive history and allows us to keep producing documentaries at this level. Because the Spitfire story was not finished. Not yet. The aircraft that had once defended Britain's skies was about to confront the final boundaries of propeller-driven flight, and what lay beyond would reshape air combat forever. By the time 1944 arrived, the war in the air no longer resembled the struggle of survival Britain had faced 4 years earlier. The Allies were now advancing on every front, and air power had become not just a shield, but a hammer. Fighters were expected to do everything: intercept, escort, reconnoiter, strike ground targets, and maintain air superiority over vast areas for prolonged periods. For the Spitfire, this final phase of the war would test not just its adaptability but the very limits of piston-engine flight. The Merlin engine, refined through countless variants, was approaching perfection. And that was the problem. Perfection left no room to grow. Engineers at Rolls-Royce understood that no amount of further tuning could deliver the leap in performance the next phase of the war demanded. So Britain took a gamble on something bigger. The answer was the Griffon engine, a 36.9-liter monster compared to the Merlin's smaller displacement. Installed in the Spitfire Mark XIV, it produced over 2,000 horsepower, a staggering figure for a single-engine fighter. The aircraft that emerged from this pairing was still called a Spitfire, but in character, it was something new entirely. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. Torque was brutal. Takeoffs demanded strength and discipline. The 5-bladed propeller bit into the air with raw force, pulling the aircraft forward with an urgency earlier Spitfires had never known. Speeds climbed toward 450 miles per hour, brushing against the practical ceiling of what propeller-driven fighters could achieve. This was the Spitfire at full stretch. Against late-war German aircraft, including improved Focke-Wulf 190 variants, the Mark XIV was more than competitive. It could climb faster, intercept higher, and strike harder. The balance that had shifted back and forth earlier in the war now tilted decisively toward the Allies. Germany lacked skill or courage, but because time and resources were no longer on its side. Yet even now, the Spitfire's role was evolving. By 1944, the aircraft was no longer confined to air-to-air combat. Spitfires hunted V-1 flying bombs over southern England, racing at extreme speed just meters above the ground. Others carried cameras instead of guns, flying deep reconnaissance missions that shaped entire campaigns. Some carried bombs under their wings, striking rail lines and troop movements. Navalast Verjans. The Seafires operated from aircraft carriers, bringing the Spitfire's lineage to the open sea. The Interceptor had become a specialist and then a generalist, but with every added role came added weight, added stress, and added complexity. Late-war Spitfires were heavier, faster, and more demanding than their ancestors. The gentle balance of Mitchell's original design was gone, replaced by a machine that required constant respect. This was no longer an aircraft for beginners, and even as the Mark 14 proved itself, engineers were already looking beyond it, the final wartime and immediate post-war versions. Culminating in the Spitfire Mark 24, pushed performance even further. Stronger airframes, heavier armament, and more powerful engines made these aircraft formidable, but also revealed a sobering truth. The age of the propeller fighter was ending. Jets were appearing on the horizon, promising speeds and altitudes no piston engine could match. Compared to them, even the most advanced Spitfire represented the peak of an era already passing. Only 80 Mark 24s were built. They entered service not as saviors, but as farewells. And yet, when the accounting was done, the Spitfire's record was unmatched. From 1938 through 1947, it remained in continuous frontline development, only Allied fighter to do so. It evolved not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable. Every phase of the war reshaped it. Every enemy advance forced another response. The Spitfire did not win the war alone. No aircraft could, but it never stopped answering the war's demands, no matter how brutal those demands became. Its greatest weapon was not speed, not firepower, not elegance. It was change, and in a conflict defined by relentless escalation, that may be the most decisive advantage of all.